In the frozen grip of 1921, a sleepy town on England's edge harbored a monster, a lawyer whose polite smile masked a deadly game. With arsenic, he turned tea into a slow, gruesome death. But how many drank from his cup before the truth spilled out? Picture Hay-on-Wye in 1920. A sleepy speck of a town nestled between the rolling green hills of England and the wild edge of Wales. It was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked, where neighbors swapped gossip over tea, and life crept along at its own lazy pace. Into this quiet world stepped Herbert Armstrong, a 52-year-old lawyer with a sharp mind and a sharper wardrobe. Small in stature but big in presence, he lived in a tidy home with his wife Catherine, a woman of routine, and their 3 children, all tucked away behind a picket fence that promised normalcy. But something rotten was stirring beneath that polished veneer, a darkness no one saw coming. This was early 20th century England, a time when the law was finally flexing its muscles against crime. Yet forensic science lagged behind, crude, untested, and ripe for a clever man to slip through the cracks. Money was tight, too. Small-town lawyers like Armstrong clawed for every client, their reputations hanging by a thread in a world obsessed with appearances. When his case erupted, it sent shockwaves through the nation. Headlines screamed, tongues wagged. But then, just as quickly, it vanished from memory. Why? Maybe it wasn't bloody enough, not twisted enough, to claw its way into the pantheon of Britain's grim legends. Herbert Armstrong didn't strike anyone as a monster, not at first glance anyway. Born in 1869 beneath the heavy clouds of an English autumn, he'd come of age in a world that demanded grit, slogging through the damp, miserable trenches of military life before hanging up his rifle for good. When the dust of that chapter settled, he traded the chaos of war for the quiet order of a lawyer's desk, planting himself in Hay-on-Wye by 1920, a speck of a town where the wind carried whispers of hayfields and the people wore trust like a second skin. At 52, Armstrong had honed a persona that fit him like a tailored suit, a compact figure with a sharp gaze, a man who could unravel legal knots with ease and charm a room with a tip of his hat. To the townsfolk, he was a fixture, dependable, respectable, the sort who'd earned his place among them. His home stood as proof of that stability, a modest but proud house where his 3 children darted through the rooms, their laughter bouncing off walls papered with routine. Beside him was Catherine, his wife of nearly 2 decades, a woman whose steady hands kept their little world turning. Until, that is, the gears began to grind. By the tail end of 1920, an unease settled over their lives, faint at first, like a shadow creeping across the floor. Catherine, then 47, started to falter. It came in waves, sharp, merciless cramps that clawed at her stomach, bending her double in the stillness of their home. Soon, sickness followed, violent bouts of nausea that left her gasping, her skin drained to a ghostly pallor, her strength seeping away day by day. The neighbors, peering over fences, murmured their theories. A stubborn flu, perhaps, or the toll of raising a family in a town where money didn't flow freely. "She'll pull through," they'd say, shrugging it off as life's ordinary burdens. But what brewed beneath was no simple ailment. It was a calculated rot, festering unnoticed. History would later crack the case wide open, with brittle pages from the Times laying bare a chilling detail. Armstrong had taken to haunting the local pharmacy, his voice smooth as he asked for arsenic, claiming it was just to tame the wild weeds strangling his garden. A flimsy story, but no one batted an eye. Not yet. Back at home, the family maid began to notice something off. She'd linger in the kitchen's half-light, watching her employer fuss over the kettle with an almost theatrical care, steeping Catherine's tea in a ritual that felt too practiced, too precise. Each cup he handed over carried a hidden venom, a slow, invisible thread of death woven into every sip. The maid's words, etched into courtroom records years later, would unmask that facade, painting a picture of a man whose kindness was a mask for something unspeakable. In Hay-on-Wye, where suspicion was as rare as a storm in summer, no one thought to question it. Not the neighbors swapping tales over tea, not the children playing in the yard, not even Catherine, who drank her doom with the trust of a wife who'd never known betrayal. Armstrong, with his lawyer's mind and a predator's patience, had set his plan in motion, and the first act of his grim play was already unfolding. Catherine Armstrong's life flickered out on February 22, 1921, a cold, gray day that swallowed her last gasp after months of relentless suffering. What began as fleeting discomfort had morphed into a grueling ordeal. Her body wasting away, her strength leached until she was little more than a husk, too fragile to rise from her bed. The end arrived without fanfare, no cries echoing through the house, no frantic rush for help, just a stillness that settled over Hay-on-Wye like frost on a window pane. The townsfolk saw it as a quiet tragedy, the kind that visits every family sooner or later. The local doctor, peering through his spectacles, jotted "heart failure" on the death certificate, his pen scratching out an explanation that felt tidy enough. Neighbors gathered, heads bowed, offering murmured condolences as Herbert Armstrong stepped into the role of the bereaved widower. He wore his sorrow well, eyes downcast, hands clasped, guiding Catherine's coffin to its resting place with a dignity that seemed rehearsed. But beneath that somber mask, a colder current flowed. Within days, he was sifting through legal papers, securing her estate with a swiftness that pricked at the edges of suspicion. Most brushed it aside. Grief takes strange shapes, they reasoned, but a few tongues began to wag, sensing something amiss in his haste. Armstrong's craft was diabolical in its subtlety. Arsenic, that pale, insidious dust he'd stashed under the pretext of battling garden weeds, didn't strike like a blade or a bullet. It slithered into her world, tainting her porridge, her bread, her beloved tea, each dose a whisper of ruin that eroded her from within. Catherine hadn't merely sickened, she'd been dismantled, her life unspooled by a man who'd turned their marriage into a slow execution. Yet her grave didn't mark the end of his ambition. By autumn's chill in 1921, Armstrong set his sights on a new target, Oswald Martin, a rival lawyer whose success gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. He extended an invitation, a friendly chat over tea, a gesture draped in civility. The kettle hissed, the cups clinked, and Martin drank deeply, oblivious to the venom lurking in the brew. Hours later, he staggered home, his insides twisting, his vision blurring with a sickness that echoed Catherine's torment too closely to be chance. He clung to life, shaken but upright, while Armstrong waved it off as a quirk of fate. The facade, though, was fraying. A rummage through his coat pocket uncovered a grim relic, a folded packet of arsenic, its weight a silent confession. The teacup Martin had sipped from offered more, its rim dusted with traces of the same lethal grit, a clue too stark to ignore. Whispers swelled into murmurs, and murmurs hardened into doubt. The town's peace cracked open when Catherine's body was exhumed, her coffin pried from the earth under a sky heavy with questions. The autopsy that followed was a blunt tool by modern measure, but it carved out a revelation that stunned the examiners. Her flesh, her organs, even the roots of her hair were steeped in arsenic, levels so obscene they painted a picture of months of deliberate dosing. Her nails, clipped and studied, bore the same poison's mark, a timeline of decay etched into her very frame. This wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a meticulous undoing, orchestrated by the husband who'd stood vigil at her bedside, his hands steady as he fed her death, one spoonful at a time. The unraveling of Herbert Armstrong began with Oswald Martin's survival, a stroke of luck that turned into a spark. After that near-fatal tea in the fall of 1921, Martin didn't let it rest. His body still ached, his mind churned with unease, and he carried his suspicions to the police, his voice trembling but firm. The authorities in Hay-on-Wye, unaccustomed to such shadows in their sleepy hamlet, hesitated at first. Could a man of Armstrong's standing truly harbor such malice? But Martin's account, paired with the lingering memory of Catherine's strange demise, tipped the scales. On December 31st, 1921, as the year teetered on its final hours, officers marched into Armstrong's office, a sanctum of legal ledgers and polished wood, and hauled him out in irons. The arrest sent a jolt through the town, shattering its illusion of safety. Neighbors who'd once tipped their hats now huddled in doorways, their whispers thick with disbelief. The investigation surged forward, peeling back layers of a life that had seemed so ordinary. Witnesses stepped into the light, each adding weight to the growing pile of doubt. The maid, her hands wringing as she spoke, recounted those eerie moments in the kitchen. Armstrong's meticulous brewing, his insistence on serving Catherine himself. A ritual she'd once thought tender, but now saw as sinister. The pharmacist, a wiry man with a ledger full of secrets, confirmed the lawyer's frequent purchases of arsenic, his excuses about weeds sounding thinner with every retelling. Then came the physical evidence, cold and undeniable. A search of Armstrong's belongings unearthed a syringe, its needle glinting with the promise of precision. A tool not for healing, but for harm, laced with traces of that same pale poison. The teacup from Martin's visit, hastily scrubbed but not cleansed, yielded its own confession under scrutiny. Faint specks of arsenic clung to its porcelain curves, a silent witness to intent. The police didn't stop there. They turned to Catherine's exhumed remains, her body a map of betrayal. Forensic experts, wielding tools still rough around the edges, dug into the grim task. They found her tissues riddled with arsenic, a flood of it coursing through her veins, her liver, her very bones, a testament to a campaign of death stretched across months. Her hair, snipped and sifted, revealed a timeline of doses, each strand a marker of her slow fade. The trial loomed in April 1922, held in the stern halls of Hereford's courthouse, where the air hung heavy with anticipation. Prosecutors laid out their case like a hunter displaying a kill. Armstrong, they argued, was no grieving spouse or bumbling fool, but a calculating predator who'd wielded his legal savvy to cloak his deeds. They paraded the evidence, The syringe, the teacup, the autopsy's damning charts, each piece a nail in his fate. Witnesses took the stand, their voices cutting through the room, the maid's quiet horror, the pharmacist's nervous stammer, Martin's raw recounting of his brush with oblivion. Armstrong sat stone-faced, his defense flimsy, a tangle of denials and claims of innocence that buckled under the weight of facts. After 10 days of testimony, the jury retreated, their deliberation swift and merciless. In just 45 minutes, they returned with a verdict: guilty. On May 31st, 1922, beneath a sky as gray as his lies, Herbert Armstrong met the gallows, the noose tightening around a neck that had once carried a gentleman's collar. A killer who'd thrived in the quiet was silenced at last. Herbert Armstrong's tale didn't vanish with the snap of the noose. It lingered, festering like a wound that refused to heal. The gallows claimed him in May 1922, but as the dust settled over Hay-on-Wye, a disquieting thread began to unravel, one that the courtroom had barely grazed. After the trial, murmurs trickled through the town, soft at first, then sharper, carried by those who'd once shared tea or shaken his hand. A merchant who'd sparred with Armstrong over a deal recalled a cup of something bitter that left him retching for days, his recovery chalked up to luck. A close acquaintance, voice low, admitted to tossing out a jar of preserves gifted by the lawyer that had twisted his guts into knots. Back then, no one dared speak up. In a place where status was currency, accusing a man like Armstrong felt like tossing a match into a dry barn. Fear of scandal had sealed their lips, and his genteel air had dulled their instincts. Yet, with his guilt laid bare, those fleeting stories took on a sinister weight. Catherine's slow fade, Oswald Martin's narrow escape, were they just the beginning? What if other souls, lost to vague illnesses or sudden declines, bore the invisible mark of his arsenic stash? The packet in his coat, the syringe glinting in his desk, relics of a predator who turned poison into a craft, honed over years of calculated calm. And then, a deeper chill. Could he have passed that dark knowledge on? Was there another figure in Hay-on-Wye's quiet lanes, someone who'd watched him brew his deadly blends, studied his steady hands, and mirrored his methods in the shadows? The town's records hold no answers. No second name ever surfaced. But the possibility dangles there. A phantom killer, schooled by Armstrong's cunning, who melted into the mist of the countryside, leaving behind a trail too faint to follow. The truth remains a taunt, a riddle wrapped in the fog of a forgotten crime, begging to be hunted down. Herbert Armstrong's downfall shines a grim light on a killer who thrived in the mundane, a man who turned tea into a weapon and trust into a trap. The arsenic that soaked Catherine's bones, the syringe that betrayed his intent, and the courtroom's swift justice peeled back the curtain on a mind as sharp as it was ruthless. History captured it all. The maid's trembling words, the autopsy's stark findings, a town jolted awake by its own blindness. Yet this tale, once blazed across headlines, slipped into the dust of obscurity. Too tame, perhaps, beside bloodier legends. Or is there more we've missed? Did Armstrong's shadow stretch further than we know, seeding secrets that still lurk unclaimed? Subscribe to Forgotten Crimes. Hit that bell and drop your theories below. Was he a lone poisoner, or did he ignite a hidden chain of death?